Night ambush behind religious guise. In November 1286, the Danish countryside lay quiet under a blanket of early winter frost. King Eric V had spent the day hunting with close companions through the forests of northern Jutland. As darkness fell, the royal party sought shelter for the night, choosing a church barn near Finderup. The king was 37 years old, known for his imposing build and commanding presence. He had ruled Denmark for 14 years, earning both loyal followers and bitter enemies. That evening, after feasting and drinking, Eric retired to his makeshift bed of straw, unaware that death awaited him in the shadows. Shortly after midnight, figures moved silently through the darkness. Conspirators disguised as monks had hidden themselves inside the barn hours earlier. Their robes concealed not religious texts, but sharp daggers and axes. They waited until the king's guards grew drowsy and the sounds of deep breathing filled the space. The attack came with sudden, shocking violence. The false friars rushed toward the sleeping king, their weapons raised. Eric woke to the sensation of cold steel piercing his flesh. The first blade struck his chest, but it wasn't fatal. He was fully conscious, desperately trying to defend himself, as multiple attackers descended. One after another, the blades plunged into his body. Each stab brought new waves of agony as he fought to escape. His screams echoed through the barn, but his guards had been strategically separated from him. No help would come. The assassins continued their frenzied assault. Tradition states that Eric suffered exactly 56 separate wounds, each one carefully delivered to maximize pain without causing immediate death. Blood soaked the straw beneath him as his strength faded. By dawn, the killers had vanished. When his companions entered the barn, they discovered the king's body, battered beyond recognition, the straw around him stained dark crimson. His face was frozen in a mask of terror and pain. The Danish throne had been vacated in a single night of calculated brutality. The Harem Conspiracy. In 1155 BCE, Egypt was ruled by Ramesses III, a pharaoh at the height of his power. He had defeated foreign invaders, built massive monuments, and established decades of prosperity. At 65, he was still vigorous, expected to rule for many more years. But within the walls of his own palace, a deadly plot was forming. The conspiracy centered around Tia, one of the pharaoh's wives, and her son Pentuer. They were not the primary royal family. Tia's son had been passed over for succession. Driven by ambition and resentment, they recruited palace officials, guards, and even practitioners of magic to help them assassinate the pharaoh. On a day when Ramesses was scheduled to attend a religious ceremony at the harem quarters, the conspirators waited. As he turned a corner in the palace corridor, they struck. The initial attack came from behind, swift and unexpected. Guards who were part of the plot blocked any escape route. The pharaoh fought back. A toe on his right foot was completely severed in the struggle. The bone hacked through, cleanly with a bronze blade. As he collapsed, one of the assassins, likely a trusted bodyguard, approached with a sharp copper dagger. In a single decisive movement, he slashed the pharaoh's throat. The cut was precise and deep. It severed the trachea completely and cut through both carotid arteries and jugular veins. Blood sprayed across the polished stone floor as Ramesses clutched at his neck. He was still conscious, feeling the warm rush of blood between his fingers as he tried desperately to stem the flow. Within seconds, the pharaoh's strength began to fade. His lungs filled not with air, but with his own blood. His body convulsed as oxygen deprivation set in. In less than 2 minutes, the most powerful man in the ancient world lay dead in a spreading pool of royal blood. The conspirators had succeeded, but their victory was short-lived. Every participant in the plot was captured, tried, and executed within weeks. The Queen with no sword. On May 19, 1536, dawn broke over the Tower of London with an unusual silence. Inside, Anne Boleyn prepared for her final moments. Just 3 years earlier, she had been crowned Queen of England after Henry VIII broke with Rome to marry her. Now, at 35, she faced execution on charges of adultery, incest, and treason, accusations fabricated by those who wanted her removed. Anne had spent her last night in prayer. She knew there would be no reprieve. The executioner had been specially imported from Calais, an expert swordsman rather than the usual axeman used for traitors. It was Henry's final gift to the woman he had once pursued relentlessly, a swift, clean death. By 8 o'clock, a crowd of around 1,000 spectators had gathered on Tower Green. Guards escorted Anne from her chambers. She wore a dark gray damask gown trimmed with fur and a crimson kirtle underneath, the color of martyrdom. Her face showed remarkable composure. When she reached the low wooden scaffold, Anne addressed the crowd briefly. She praised the king and accepted her fate, but maintained her innocence. The spectators watched in uncomfortable silence. Unlike most condemned prisoners, she showed no fear. Anne removed her headdress and tucked her dark hair under a simple white cap to expose her neck fully. The executioner, following tradition, asked her forgiveness, which she granted. Then came an unusual moment that unsettled witnesses. The swordsman had an assistant distract Anne by pointing to something in the distance while he reached for his sword. She knelt upright, repeating quietly, "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul." The sword was razor-sharp and wielded with expert precision. It severed her head completely with a single horizontal stroke, so quick that many in the crowd didn't immediately realize it had happened. Blood gushed onto the straw-covered platform. Most disturbing to witnesses was what happened next. Anne's lips continued to move for several seconds after decapitation, as though still forming her final prayer. Her eyes opened and closed once before becoming still. 3 blows to silence a queen. On February 8, 1587, the Great Hall of Fotheringhay Castle was prepared for an execution. Mary Stuart, former Queen of Scots, had spent 19 years in English captivity, accused of plotting against her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I. At 44, she had survived decades of political intrigue, but her final hour had arrived. Mary entered the hall at 8 o'clock in the morning, walking with difficulty due to severe rheumatism. Despite her pain, she carried herself with regal dignity. She wore a crimson-brown dress, the liturgical color of martyrdom, with a black veil that fell to her shoulders. Around her neck hung a crucifix and an Agnus Dei. 200 spectators watched in silence as she climbed the steps to the scaffold, which was draped in the black cloth. She refused help from the executioners, declaring, "I thank you, but I am not accustomed to undressing before so many people, nor to having such attendance." With steady hands, she removed her veil, her gown, and finally her bodice, revealing a crimson petticoat. The entire room could see she wore the color of Catholic martyrdom from head to toe. Her ladies-in-waiting sobbed as they blindfolded her with a white cloth. Mary knelt at the low oak block. Her last words were clear. "In manus tuas, Domine, commendo spiritum meum. Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." The executioner raised his axe and swung. The first blow missed its mark, striking the back of her head instead of her neck. Mary made no sound, but witnesses saw her lips moving in prayer. The second blow cut through most of her neck but left a small piece of sinew. The executioner had to saw through it with the third stroke before her head was completely severed. When the executioner lifted her head and proclaimed, "God save the Queen," the gruesome reality became apparent. The auburn hair in his hand was a wig. Mary's actual hair was short and completely gray, falling away onto the scaffold. More shocking still, her small dog emerged from beneath her petticoats where it had hidden throughout the ordeal. It positioned itself between her separated head and body, whimpering and refusing to leave, becoming soaked in the pool of royal blood. Tsar Nicholas II and the Romanovs. In the early morning hours of July 17, 1918, the last Tsar of Russia and his family were awakened in their quarters in Yekaterinburg. Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, their 5 children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, along with their physician and 3 servants, were told to dress quickly. The Bolshevik guards claimed they needed to be moved for safety reasons as White Russian forces approached the city. The imperial family was led downstairs to a small windowless basement room measuring only 20 by 16 feet. They arranged themselves against the far wall, Nicholas standing protectively in front of his 13-year-old hemophiliac son Alexei, who sat in a chair due to his injury. The women stood behind them. No one suspected what was about to happen. At approximately 2:15 a.m., 11 armed men filed into the room. Their leader, Yakov Yurovsky, read a brief statement. "In view of the fact that your relatives continue their offensive against Soviet Russia, the Presidium of Ural Regional Soviet has decided to execute you." Before Nicholas could fully comprehend these words, Yurovsky drew his Colt pistol and fired directly at the Tsar's chest. The bullet pierced his heart, killing him almost instantly. The other executioners immediately opened fire, creating a deafening roar in the confined space. Thick gun smoke quickly filled the room, making it difficult to see. What happened next defied the killer's expectations. Despite multiple gunshot wounds, the Tsarina and her daughters didn't die immediately. Unknown to the executioners, the women had sewn jewels and diamonds into their corsets, creating a partial bulletproof vest. As the smoke cleared, the horrified gunmen discovered some of their victims still moaning and moving. The executioners drew bayonets and began stabbing the survivors repeatedly. The youngest daughter, 17-year-old Anastasia, screamed and tried to crawl toward the door. She was caught and bayoneted multiple times in her chest. Alexei, still breathing despite several gunshot wounds, received a final pistol shot to the head. The massacre lasted approximately 20 minutes. When it was finally over, the floor was slick with blood and the walls riddled with bullet holes and bayonet marks. The bodies were stripped, dismembered with axes, burned with sulfuric acid, and buried in a forest outside the city. The Blood Eagle's Wings. In 867 CE, King Aelle of Northumbria faced the wrath of the most feared warriors in Europe. The sons of the legendary Viking leader Ragnar Lodbrok had crossed the North Sea with a massive force called the Great Heathen Army. Their purpose was singular: to avenge their father's death at Aelle's hands years earlier. The Northumbrian king had reportedly executed Ragnar by throwing him into a pit of venomous snakes. Now, as battle lines formed outside York, Aelle knew the Vikings would show no mercy. His forces were overwhelmed in a decisive defeat, and Aelle himself was captured alive. exactly as the Norsemen had planned. Ivar the Boneless, Ragnar's most ruthless son, personally oversaw what would happen next. The captured king was brought to the Viking camp as warriors gathered in a circle to witness his fate. Eyjolf's hands and feet were bound tightly with rawhide that would shrink as it dried, cutting into his flesh. The ritual began at dawn. Two warriors held Eyjolf face down on a wooden table as Ivar approached with a sharp knife. With practiced precision, he made a deep incision along the king's spine. Blood flowed immediately, but this was only the beginning of the torment. Using the tip of his blade, Ivar separated the skin and muscle from Eyjolf's back, exposing the ribs. The king was still fully conscious, his screams echoing across the camp. No mercy was shown. No quick death granted. This was the ritual known as the Blood Eagle, the most feared execution in the Viking world. With specialized bone tools, Ivar and his brothers carefully broke each rib at the spine, then pulled them outward one by one, splaying them like wings. The sound of cracking bone punctuated Eyjolf's weakening cries. Salt was rubbed into the wound, intensifying the agony to unimaginable levels. In the final phase of the ritual, they reached inside the still-living king's body cavity and pulled out his lungs, drawing them through the wounds and draping them over the extended ribs. The result resembled bloody eagle wings spread across his back. Eyjolf remained alive throughout much of this process, his body prevented from the mercy of shock by stimulants forced down his throat. Only when his lungs were fully extracted did death finally claim him, ending the most horrific royal execution in medieval history. The 9-Day Queen's Trembling Hands. On February 12, 1554, a slight figure walked across the green within the Tower of London toward a low wooden scaffold. Lady Jane Grey was just 16 years old and had reigned as Queen of England for merely 9 days the previous July before being deposed and imprisoned. Her crime was not of her own making. She had been placed on the throne through the machinations of powerful men, including her father-in-law. The teenager had spent her last night in prayer, knowing her youth would not save her. Mary Tudor, the rightful queen by bloodline, had initially shown mercy, but a rebellion, led by Jane's father, sealed her fate. As dawn broke, she understood she would never see another sunset. Jane walked to her execution with remarkable composure. She wore a simple black dress, her light brown hair tucked beneath a cap. Witnesses noted she carried a small prayer book in her hands, which she read from until the final moment. Her face betrayed no fear, though her body trembled slightly in the February cold. Upon reaching the scaffold, Jane handed her gloves and handkerchief to her ladies. She then addressed the small crowd gathered to watch her die, acknowledging her unlawful acceptance of the crown, but maintaining her innocence of any treasonous intent. Her voice never wavered as she spoke her final words. "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." The executioner, as was customary, knelt and asked for her forgiveness, which she granted readily. Then came the moment that witnesses would later describe as most heartbreaking. When instructed to place her head on the block, Jane froze. Despite her spiritual preparation, this physical reality momentarily overwhelmed her. "What shall I do? Where is it?" she asked, suddenly disoriented on the unfamiliar platform. Her eyes, now blindfolded with a cloth, could not guide her. Her hands reached out, groping blindly in the air, finding nothing. For terrifying seconds, she panicked, turning her head frantically. "Where is it? What shall I do?" she repeated. The executioner gently took her trembling hands and guided them to the wooden block. Once she felt its shape, Jane regained her composure, positioning herself correctly. She stretched her neck across the oak surface and uttered her final words. "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." The axe fell in a single clean stroke. The head of the youngest English monarch in history rolled into the straw, her lips still moving in silent prayer for several seconds afterward. Betrayed at the Banquet. In 1130, Norway's most powerful monarch was feasting in the Great Hall at Hustad. King Sigurd, known as the Crusader, had earned his reputation by leading Norwegian forces to Jerusalem 2 decades earlier, the first European king to personally undertake such a journey. At 40 years old, he still maintained the physical strength that had made him legendary in battle, but his mind had grown increasingly unstable. The hall was filled with the kingdom's elite, jarls, landowners, and warriors who had pledged loyalty to Sigurd's banner. Massive oak tables groaned under platters of meat and horns of mead. The king sat at the head table, seemingly in good spirits as he drank deeply and called for songs celebrating his victories. What Sigurd didn't realize was that many of these men had already chosen to support his son Magnus in a bid for power. They had planned this feast meticulously, selecting the perfect moment to strike. As the night progressed, they ensured Sigurd's cup was never empty, waiting for the heavy mead to dull his legendary reflexes. Near midnight, when the king was deep in his cups, a subtle signal passed between the conspirators. One moment, Sigurd was laughing at a skald's poem. The next, his closest advisors rose from their seats with daggers drawn. The first blade struck him in the side, slipping between his ribs with practiced precision. Sigurd roared in shock and pain, surging to his feet with such force that the heavy wooden table overturned. Goblets and platters crashed to the floor as he reached for his absent sword. In that moment of confusion, 3 more daggers found their mark, one in his back, another in his shoulder, a third in his abdomen. Despite his wounds, the king fought back with bare hands, breaking the jaw of one attacker with a single punch. But more conspirators closed in. A blade sliced across his throat, sending a spray of royal blood across the table. Another pierced his chest, puncturing his lung. Sigurd collapsed across the feast table, gasping for breath as his blood pooled among spilled mead and scattered food. His fingers still clutched at a dagger handle protruding from his chest. His eyes locked on the faces of men who had knelt before him that very morning. "Oath-breakers," he managed to whisper through bloodied lips. These were his final words before the light faded from his eyes. His body sprawled across the very table where he had just toasted to his kingdom's prosperity.